This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. Elizabeth asked me to speak in English, so I will speak in English, but we can ask questions in French later if you prefer, or in English, I don't mind. Do you think we could get that blind? Is that possible? Oh, sorry. Thank you. Oh, well, never mind. It's okay. I just thought that you can see the pictures better, but it doesn't matter. It's not too serious. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to talk about some research that I have done, not on my own, but with a research team in Northumbria, the northeast part of England and the southeast part of Scotland mainly, and specifically relating to the sites of Wearmouth and Jarrow, the famous 7th century monasteries, where of course Bede lived. That's what they're most famous for. But this is a lecture of two parts, assuming I have enough time. So the first part, we'll look at Wearmouth and Jarrow and the work that we've done recently. And the second part, I'll try and think more broadly about how that work can be interpreted to help us understand what happened in the conversion period in 7th, 8th, perhaps 9th century Northumbria. So, you will doubtless know, Northumbria is famous for its early medieval archaeology, the early medieval archaeology and history of what we call the Golden Age, from around about 650 AD to around about 850, the time when we have the fabulous written sources of Bede. And early medieval Northumbria is famous particularly for a number of different types of evidence. So we have Bede's writings, but we also have writings from a whole cohort of other 8th century especially writers writing histories of monasteries and saints, and Bede's writings, the history of the English Church, saints' lives and other similar texts, which were in great demand throughout Europe, most famously manuscripts like the Codex Amiatinus, for example, which was produced probably at Wearmouth and Jarrow. But Northumbria also has a range of other types of unusual evidence. In archaeological evidence, the church archaeologists have been very busy excavating a whole series of monastic sites at Wearmouth and Jarrow that we'll see in a minute, but other places like Whitby and Hodham and Whithorn over here in southwest Scotland, a series of excavations which mean that there are more excavated early medieval monasteries from this region than from most other regions of Europe. A related type of evidence is the evidence of standing buildings. North of the Alps, as you know, church buildings from the 7th, 8th, 9th century are relatively rare. But especially in the Tyne Valley, which is this area here, there's a very great concentration of surviving buildings, either complete or fragmentary. So, for example, when I take my master's students out on a field trip along the Tyne Valley, we can visit 9 Anglo-Saxon churches in one day, which is quite unusual to be able to see that. There's nowhere else in England where there's such a great density of early medieval structures surviving appreciably intact. And another related kind of artistic output is the sculpture of Northumbria. This is a fragment of the Rothbury cross, which is a late 8th or early 9th century cross shaft. This one is in the museum at the university at Newcastle. The other part of it is still in Rothbury, which is about here. And this is one of example of many examples of early medieval sculpture in Northumbria from the 8th and 9th centuries, and also from the Viking Age of the 10th and 11th centuries. So there's a lot of evidence that we are very familiar with. Now, in the first part of my talk, I shall revisit two of the most famous sites, Wearmouth and Jarrow, because we've recently undertaken a fieldwork project there, nothing on the scale of the excavations by Professor Rosemary Cramp, which Elizabeth already mentioned, who laid the foundations for all of the subsequent work on the site. This is St. Peter's at Wearmouth, which was the first of the two monasteries to be founded early in the 670s by Benedict Bishop, and the site, the standing remains at Wearmouth comprise this tower and the west wall of the church. But the excavated remains fill out the picture of that. So this is the composite of the excavations by Professor Cramp, who identified a series of different buildings relating to the early medieval phases. There's also a later medieval priory and important post-medieval site here as well. And Professor Cramp began working there in the late 1950s. And she started working here at St. Paul's a little bit later. St. Paul's was the second monastery of these two famous monasteries to be founded in the 680s. And here, Professor Cramp excavated again. These are her excavation trenches, the kind of composite map of them. This was a project that lasted over 25 years, so she was going back many times and undertaking fieldwork. And this is the church as it is today. So this part of the church today is almost the intact structure of an Anglo-Saxon church, probably from the late 7th or possibly early 8th century. The bottom of the tower here is also Anglo-Saxon in date, though the exact date is a little uncertain. This part of the church dates from the 1860s, but it replaces an 18th century church, which in turn replaced another large Anglo-Saxon church on the site. So there were two standing Anglo-Saxon churches here until the middle of the 18th century. And associated with the monastery were a number of other buildings, these buildings A, B and D here, which are large stone buildings which provided accommodation of different sorts on the monastery. Okay, in the conclusion to her reports, Rosemary Cramp identified a number of potential themes for future work on the site. And these two sites, Wearmouth and Jarrow, were under consideration to become World Heritage sites back in 2008. Eventually a bid was submitted and was unsuccessful, so they're not UNESCO World Heritage sites. But nevertheless, there was a project to develop a management plan and a research agenda to promote that application for World Heritage status. And so, with my colleague Sarah Semple, who works at Durham University, which is Rosemary Cramp's department, we were asked to reflect on the research agenda put forward by Professor Cramp and devise a project where we might look at some of the outstanding issues relating to the site, but without doing new excavations. So a project that was essentially non-invasive or non-intrusive into the site. And so our project was devised, and we had three key aims for this project. One was to look at these churches in the context of the historic landscape. One was to try and understand the topography and layout of the monastic sites themselves better. And the third was to investigate the standing fabric of the buildings in more detail than has been done before. There was various other kind of bits of work relating to public engagement and public participation, but I'm not going to talk about those this afternoon. So, in order to try and address these research aims, we brought together a multidisciplinary team of people working in different areas. So, working on GIS-based landscape analysis, geoarchaeological investigation and paleoenvironmental survey, geophysical analysis of the site to undertake surveys, and also building recording using modern techniques, using laser scanning and using petrological survey of the stones used to build the churches to try and identify their ultimate sources. In fact, that part of the work produced some quite interesting results that I'll tell you about in a little while. To address this research agenda, we decided to work at three principal scales. You can see the site of St Paul's at Jarrow is here on the River Tyne, and the site of Wearmouth is here about 12 kilometres away on the River Wear. And so we identified a block of landscape that we would try and analyse to try and understand the early medieval location, the choices made about location for the monasteries better. So that was the first level, the landscape level. Secondly, we wanted to work on the immediate environs of the monasteries. And so we used geoarchaeological survey and geophysical survey to do that. As you'll see in a minute, there are some specific challenges involved in working on these two sites because both of the sites have been heavily industrialised in the 19th and the 20th centuries. And finally, as I said before, we were looking at the most detailed level at the church buildings themselves. So, very quickly, we set up a GIS and we integrated into our GIS all the spatial data that we could capture. And that included data about archaeological sites, of course, included air photography, data from documentary sources, and also historic and modern maps. So these ones that you see, these are the early 19th century tithe maps, which we scanned and digitised from the Palace Green Library of the Bishops in Durham. And that enabled us to undertake a retrogressive analysis, moving backwards from the present through the whole series of available maps back to the earliest one, whatever it is for each area. So this is the area of the Roman fort at Arbea, which is the easternmost fort in the Hadrian's Wall system, right on the coast at the mouth of the River Tyne, which falls within that study area. Well, one of the key challenges, the key problems with this sort of landscape approach in this area is that this is a heavily industrialised and urbanised area. Here's the site of the Church of Jarrow as depicted on the mid-19th century Ordnance Survey map. Here's the same site shown on a 17th century survey of the River Tyne. And this is an area that was a focus for massive industrial growth after 1850. After 1850, the city of Newcastle lost its monopoly on the River Tyne and the trade and industry on the river, and all the small towns down the river were able to rapidly develop their industrial output. And so we have big port and dock facilities, a whole string of factories producing chemicals, mines, shipbuilding installations, very, very rapid growth. This is what that area looks like now. But This is the equivalent series of maps for the monastery at Wearmouth, St. Peter's Wearmouth, which is now in the city of Sunderland. This is the site of the church in the late 1970s. This photograph is taken by Norman McCord, who our research centre is named after. And in the 1970s, this was a big shipbuilding area. Okay, they've stopped building ships there now. Now they produce students instead because they've replaced the shipyard with a university. I'm not sure if that's a great idea, but anyway. But also here then, there's a series of very intensive industrial developments on the river, in this case from the late 18th century onwards, when the shipbuilding yards really developed. In that whole block of landscape, there was also massive development of new housing before and after the Second World War. So from the 1930s, housing developed, and this map just shows, the grey just shows 20th century housing development. So as you can see, if you look on here, in the 1890s, most of this area was fields, agricultural land. By 2009, most of this area is housing and industrial development. And so that's a big challenge for us as archaeologists in trying to understand the development of that landscape. So one of the challenges was the fact that this landscape has been built over. It's not really possible to undertake new archaeological survey across such a big industrialised and urbanised area. So we were reliant on using documentary sources, map sources and air photographs. Now we can say quite a lot about this area. We know, for example, that there were some significant areas of enclosure from rough moorland in the 18th and the 19th centuries. And we know that most of the enclosure of fields, creating that pattern that's so characteristic in England, happened in this area in the 17th century. This is the village of Cleedon, which is now just a suburb of Sunderland. You can see this is the site of the medieval village. It was surrounded by open fields up until 1615, and then another phase of enclosure. So this is Ogilvy's 1675 route map, and on the route map, you can't read it from there, but this is Cleedon, this is the village of Cleedon, and here it says, enter cornfields of open arable, and the map shows depicting open fields all the way up to here. And so this was all enclosed in the end of the 17th century. This was enclosed in the 1680s. So we know quite a lot about the history of that landscape. We can also, there are either surviving fragments of medieval field systems. This is ridge and furrow surviving from medieval fields. Here, because this was an army firing range. So no houses have been built there. The firing range for live firing ammunition closed 5 years ago. Probably now it will be turned into houses. But anyway, there's some nice... You can see the lines of the medieval ridge and furrow, which helps us identify where the farming took place. And using those combination of sources, we were able to identify where, at least in the 13th and the 14th century, most of the medieval, the pattern of the medieval agriculture was. So we've got the site at Wearmouth here, surrounded by open fields here in white, and Jarrow here, open fields. And using those sources we've looked at, we were able to add these pinky brown areas, which were all areas of open field as well. So helping us to understand the context of the monasteries a little better than we had previously. So I'll move to look at the sites of the monasteries themselves. Clearly this is St. Peter's at Wearmouth. Clearly this is entirely modern topography. This is the site of that university that's been built where the shipyard used to be. And this is essentially the open area that's available for archaeological survey around the church. So we undertook various different types of survey, and you can see that immediately there's some promising looking results down here to the south of the church. This is the church. There's some significant features identified here and also here. This is magnetometer data. Unfortunately, This is not a Roman barracks, which is one of the early interpretations. This is a bomb shelter from the Second World War for the people working in the shipyard adjacent. And this is the site of a gasometer, a big storage facility for gas. And the archaeology of the area around the monastery has been severely impacted by 18th, 19th and 20th century developments. So we thought we might not discover anything at all from geophysical survey, but we think possibly we may have done. This is a ground-penetrating radar, geo-radar survey around the area, which can penetrate to a greater depth than magnetometry. And it's not really very exciting. We think that this could be a previously unidentified wall. Actually, it is moderately significant because this is the outline plan of Professor Cramp's excavation. She didn't excavate this area here, and if this is correct, then it could mean that there's a parallel range of buildings to the south of the monastery, which has never been identified before. That would match what we have at Jarrow, which was excavated by Professor Cramp. So that is quite interesting. Of course, unless we go and dig a hole, we will never actually know if we've interpreted it correctly. But we live in hope. One of the more useful exercises we did here was geoarchaeology around the... Oh, I don't know what's happened to my slide. But I think it's because it's a Mac and I did it on a PC, so sorry about that. What it would have showed you is that there's a series of boreholes that have been put in around here, geoarchaeological boreholes, to look at the deposits going down to the riverside. Oh, is it going to do it in reverse order? Hey, look at that. So here's these are a series of boreholes. Now, this is the modern level of the river. But using the evidence from these boreholes and what we know about sea level change, we were able to calculate where the Anglo-Saxon waterfront was around the monastery. And miraculously, 2 of these boreholes actually produced material we could radiocarbon date from the 7th century levels. I mean, the chances are small, but nevertheless, we didn't expect it, but we were able to. So we know quite accurately what the level of the beachfront was going down to the river. And that helps us to define the relationship between the site and the river and the sea in the 7th century. So that was quite interesting. We did the same kind of work at Jarrow as well. And there we were, this is the Church of Jarrow here, and there we were able to identify a big ditch feature, for example, to the north of the site, this feature here, which I'll show you on a later slide, that this suggests that the monastery stood on a promontory which stuck out into the swampy sort of the swampy estuary of the river, very much like many other early medieval monasteries in that case. And the third level that we worked at was research on the buildings themselves. So we undertook laser scanning of the buildings to create 3D models. And my colleague John Senior undertook detailed petrographic survey, stone by stone survey, to identify the material that each stone in the Anglo-Saxon fabric was built of at both Jarrow and at Wearmouth. So that's his nice hand-coloured diagram laid over the top of the laser scan model, which is a nice kind of match of old and new. And this was very interesting because, unfortunately, the top of the slide is off. You can't quite see it. But one of the key things about both of these churches is that they contain a significant amount of Roman masonry from sites on Hadrian's Wall. And so we wanted to try and identify which sites, if possible, the stone had come from that was used. So what we did was we did the survey at the churches, and we also did survey at the Roman fort sites and parts of Hadrian's Wall to build up a database of the types of stone that were used on the different types of sites. And what we were able to show was, well, there were several quite interesting things. One thing that was very interesting that we hadn't really known before was that at St. Peter's, Wearmouth, the first of these churches to be built, this yellow stone is all freshly quarried stone by the Anglo-Saxons in the 7th or the early 8th century. Now, people have often questioned whether the Anglo-Saxons knew even how to quarry stone or where to get stone from. Turns out that they did. But also interesting here at Wearmouth is that we've got a number of architectural features where the stones have been brought from Roman forts, often as complete features, so as windows or doors from the Roman fort to be built into the church. And the interesting thing about this really was that we were able to identify which Roman forts these were coming from. So we know that a significant amount of the fabric built into the church at St. Peter's, Wearmouth, had come from 10 kilometres away from that fort at Arbea on the mouth of the River Tyne. That was also quite an interesting discovery and has implications about how the monastery is getting that stone, who is giving it to them, how they're accessing it. This is a map, which shows you what I've just been saying. So, there's Arbea. Those are the stone sources used for building at Arbea. This is Segedunum, the Wallsend Roman fort, which is where I live, just outside the fort at Wallsend. And these are the sites of the stone for that. So you can see that the sites are different, or at least they're overlapping. And here's Wearmouth. Wearmouth has fresh stone quarried around the church, but it also uses stone from these quarries, which we are confident has come from the Roman site. One of the only category of stone that was monumental stone that was freshly quarried for the monasteries was these balusters. These are decorative openings for windows and doors. And I'm reliably informed by the geologist that they need to be turned on a lathe when the stone is green, when the stone is wet, to enable you to carve them. And so they're confident that the stone for these monuments would also have been quarried fresh to be built into the church. It's interesting that the source of stone for balusters at St. Peter's is different to the source of stone for balusters at St. Paul's up on the River Tyne. Now, what we discovered was that the church here was quite different in terms of the stone used to the church at Wearmouth. At Wearmouth, there was quite a lot of freshly quarried stone and some Roman material reused. At Jarrow, virtually all the stone is reused from Roman sites, both from the fort at Arbea, South Shields, and from the fort at Wallsend across the River Tyne. So there's some difference there. Again, we've got complete features being brought from Roman sites and incorporated into the fabric. And this is just a 3D model showing the different types of stone in the Anglo-Saxon parts of that 7th century structure. Good. We don't need to go into the detail of this. But it tells you what I've just said, essentially. Different sources for Wearmouth and Jarrow, both reusing Roman material. And this is the kind of material that we're talking about. Squared stones. These are photographs of bits of Hadrian's Wall. This is actually at Arbea, Roman fort. And this is that stone when it's built into the churches. And you can see that some of these are decorated pieces that are built into the churches, but not that many decorated pieces built into the churches at Wearmouth and Jarrow. Okay, good. We're not doing too badly for time. So that was just a quick outline of some of the results from some of the work that we've done at Wearmouth and Jarrow, looking at the landscape, looking at the sites, and looking at the buildings themselves. What I want to talk about now is a little bit on the interpretation of those kinds of results, both from the sites that we've worked on and from other sites. how we can use these kind of information to help us understand better what was happening in 7th and 8th century Northumbria. And I have pretentiously called this the bones of the Northumbrian landscape, for reasons that you hopefully will see. But it's bones used sort of metaphorically for understanding the structure and development of the landscape, but also because bones play an important part in the story that we're looking at. More prosaically, we might discuss these things under the heading of technologies of conversion. Now, historians and archaeologists have, of course, identified the conversion to Christianity as a key driving force in social change in 7th and 8th century Northumbria. This is a quotation from David Rollison, who wrote a lovely book called Northumbria. It's hard to escape the conclusion, he says, that conversion to Christianity was either the most formative process in the development of culture in Northumbria or opened the way to processes which were. Here's another quotation from a book published in 2003, also the second edition of Peter Brown's Rise of Western Christendom. And he also emphasizes the importance of the conversion to Christianity for the creation of what he calls micro-kingdoms in the furthest northern parts of Europe in the 7th and 8th centuries. And he argues that the people who were creating the churches in places like Northumbria were striving to cancel out the hiatus between centre and periphery, between Jarrow and Rome, by making little Romes available on their home ground. And I think both of these scholars make excellent points. And I'm not seeking to disagree that Christianity was an extraordinarily important force in 7th and 8th century Northumbria. Indeed, it's quite clear that the beliefs of people, at least the elite stratum of society, did change at this period. But what I'm going to try and do is take a slightly different perspective on this. So I'll place my emphasis on understanding what we might call the technologies of conversion, and the role that these technologies play in the social changes of the 6th to 8th centuries. Instead of assuming that conversion inevitably resulted in the adoption of a package of related social innovations and complexities, what I want to try and explore is how some of the social relationships that existed before the conversion to Christianity endured and were developed using these technologies of conversion, or technologies of Christianity. And so, for example, what I'm suggesting is that the adoption of Christianity and the use of these technologies can be explored alongside factors such as the rise and development of kingship and the increasing investment in the power of fixed places in the landscape, to help us explain how social change actually happened on the ground. Now, I owe a big debt to my colleague Chris Fowler, who is a prehistorian, and he works on Neolithic and Bronze Age archaeology. And we were talking and thinking about this issue, about how these social changes happen. And in fact, what I'm talking about here, we are publishing an article together in a book that will be coming out soon on this subject. And it draws on what Chris calls a relational realist perspective. And in this perspective, the properties of any object, any entity, are dependent on the relationships which comprise that entity at any given time. So we might think of those relationships as material or physical types of relationships, but they are also social and cultural and spiritual relationships. And so these stones provide us with an example of what I'm talking about. These are some stones at the site of Arbea Roman fort. These stones, if they're Arbea Roman fort in the 7th century, they have a different value to if the stones that were here are taken away and built into the church, the monastery at Wearmouth. Because by being sacralised as part of the church, the stones acquire a series of new relationships, partly because they've gone through the ritual of sacralisation, partly also because they've been given by somebody, given to the monastery by somebody, in this case almost certainly the king of Northumbria, whose royal residence this place was. So, we can think of stone churches, like the ones at Wearmouth and Jarrow, as complex assemblages of entangled relationships. And the features that contribute to the existence of these buildings were also transformed by their participation in these networks. So including the people who commissioned the churches, built them, looked after them, and worshipped them. And the transformation of the Northumbrian world in the 7th and the 8th centuries involved many, many different interrelated technologies, each of them being reliant on others. Together, though, these intertwined technologies are what combined to create social change across northeast England. And they're the key factors in what produced the Christian kingdom of Northumbria. So, what I will try to do is explain what I mean about this in relation to a series of different types of material and how they worked. So we'll look briefly at building in stone, at the parcelling of land, at the use of writing, and at burial and relics. And I won't talk for each one about very long. Okay. So, in contrast to the great timber longhouses of northern Europe, of southern Scandinavia, Denmark and Sweden, timber buildings in 6th century Britain were very small. On the whole, they rarely exceeded 50 square metres in footprint. They normally were built using very simple technologies, just with post holes to hold up the walls. There are some well-known examples. Hang on a minute, there's supposed to be some words that go with this. Oh, yes. There's some well-known examples in Yorkshire, places like West Heslington you may know of. But there are also recently discovered examples in Northumberland, North Northumberland. This example at Cheviot Quarry near Millfield is one. These buildings didn't last very long. They normally lasted just one generation before they were replaced by another. And they were normally scattered across the landscape as you see. Now, we know that around the beginning of the 7th century, other building techniques, such as post in trench or plank in trench construction, became more common. we started to see larger buildings appearing. And instead of being relocated on different sites when they were built, they were located on the same site, so buildings started to be repaired. Although wood continued to be the main construction material, the buildings show more subdivisions within them. This is the Great Hall at Yeavering, probably the palace of the kings of early 7th century Northumbria. Now, perhaps the most important point here is that this change from those small scattered buildings to bigger, more permanent buildings, which are organised in a more structured way, took place before the conversion to Christianity. We know that sites like this one at Yeavering provided locations for large gatherings of people and public assemblies. This is the famous amphitheatre type structure made of wood at Yeavering. And they were also the focus for burial, so probably again a focus for gatherings of people. So well before the conversion to Christianity, some settlements are becoming increasingly fixed in the landscape. And also they're becoming associated permanently with kings who are establishing their rule in the Northumbrian kingdom. Now, as far as we know, the earliest Christian architecture of Northumbria didn't make a radical break with these traditions. The first churches we know of in Northumbria were made of wood, not stone, like the early examples at York and Lindisfarne. We don't know, of course, whether many wooden halls were converted into churches. Bede imagined, you're probably familiar with the famous scene where Bede imagines the desecration of a pagan temple at a place called Goodmanham in Yorkshire in the context of conversion. But it seems unlikely that Pope Gregory's advice about turning temples into churches would actually have been possible in England, because we know of almost no, if any, examples of pagan temples in Anglo-Saxon England. They probably didn't exist in the way that he imagined. Some scholars have argued that the distinctive form of some of the northern Northumbrian stone churches, the early stone churches, reproduced the grammar, if you like, the structure of those wooden buildings with their tall buildings and narrow naves and pointed roofs. Some scholars have even gone as far as to argue that they used the same units of measurement at sites like Yeavering as they did at the monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow. We know that after the first generation of wooden buildings, the most important churches were built in stone, but perhaps they still followed the same general style as the timber structures. So it wasn't so much that using stone was a good innovation for Anglo-Saxon rulers for their churches from a functional or a practical point of view, because it was complicated. Stone buildings still have to be maintained and repaired, just like wooden ones. But instead, I think I would argue that stone churches delivered a kind of technology that's useful for the creation of an image of permanence and stability. This kind of durability was also accentuated by other properties of 7th century stone buildings. Firstly, the early Northumbrians were surrounded by ruined Roman buildings, which they understood, they knew had been built in the past. Although we know from our research at Wearmouth and Jarrow that they could and did quarry fresh stone, the Northumbrians packed their churches full of Roman spolia and reused blocks. It's interesting in this context that the written sources also present stone buildings as something exotic. Bede emphasises how Benedict Bishop had to send to France for masons and glaziers to glaze the windows, even though actually it's almost certain he didn't need to, because we know from other sources that Wilfrid, another Northumbrian churchman, had already been building stone buildings and glazed the windows of the church at York some years before Benedict Bishop built the churches at Wearmouth and Jarrow. But nevertheless, the important point is probably that Benedict's use of stone at Wearmouth and Jarrow created a link to the contemporary Christian centres of continental Europe. Using this technology of stone construction, the churches were literally petrified. Not only did they become permanent features in the landscape, but the social and the political relationships that they represented were also fixed in a durable form. And we saw before that the churches at Wearmouth and Jarrow got their building stone from the Roman forts at Arbea and at Segedunum, at South Shields and Wallsend. And those two forts were almost certainly the property of the kings of Northumbria at that time. So not only were the kings providing the land, as we'll see, for the churches, they were actually providing the building material as well, creating a series of new relationships in the establishment of those monasteries. Okay, so we'll think now a little bit about land and boundaries. Now, we have no documentary sources from 5th or 6th century Northumbria that tell us about land holding practices amongst the early Anglo-Saxons. But as we saw from the evidence of settlements, it's likely that there were small-scale communities made up of family units who worked the land together. And this is a site called Shotton, which is a recently excavated early and middle Anglo-Saxon settlement in Northumbria. And here's the early phases of that site up to the mid to late 6th century. It's just been published. Typically, just a few scattered small halls. This is a very important site because it's the first one excavated in the southern part of Northumberland. So it's the only one in a 100-mile stretch, essentially. So it's quite a significant site. Now, what we see is a significant change after the middle of the 6th century. This is a site at Shotton again, in its later 7th century phase. And you can see that the difference is essentially that we now have a series of enclosures in the site and buildings located within those enclosures. And this is typical of what we see in other parts of Northumbria as well. So in Yorkshire, for example, there are a series of 8th and 9th century settlements which are divided into plots by complicated sequences of ditches, places like Cowlham and Cottam and Burdale, which have all been published in the last 10 years or so. It seems likely that changes like these probably mark the first moves towards later medieval and modern concepts of the ownership of land. Even so, in the late 6th century, before the conversion to Christianity, although these changes were starting to happen, the Anglo-Saxons didn't really have a suitable technology for land ownership. Even kings couldn't grant away land from their own family land to other people. So what they needed, these kings, was to what they needed to extend their power were suitable technologies that they could use to enable them to get more control over the land in their kingdoms. And luckily for them, converting to Christianity entailed the use of a range of methods that provided quite practical solutions to the problem of not being able to give away land. So in terms of their physical structure, the early monastery sites in Britain were often enclosed with boundaries, ditches, hedges, banks, or walls. And in this sense, their boundaries were quite similar to the developing boundaries of the secular settlements that we just saw. So this is the Church of Jarrow. This is a massive heap of rubble which was dumped here in the 1850s and later. So there's nothing accessible here. But you can see this is the outline of the old line of the river as it goes around, and this is the ditch that we identified with the geophysical survey. So the two churches stand right in the middle of a little peninsula which sticks out into what used to be the river here, making a nice boundary around that site. Boundaries like this served to reinforce three aspects that related directly to changing ideas about landholding. Firstly, the ability to exclude people from particular areas. Secondly, their stability, providing fixed locations that could act as centres for economic and political, cultural and religious activities. And thirdly, their permanence. Unlike the earlier settlements, these places were fixed and set in the landscape. And perhaps even more effectively, another new technology associated with Christianity enabled the social elites of Northumbria to develop a totally new type of landholding, and that was writing. So in what had previously been lots of words have disappeared. Let's just see if I can make them come back. I can't. All right. Well, it's Latin anyway, right? So there's an English translation down here. It's just a charter. What had previously been an illiterate world, the technology of writing enabled the Northumbrian elite to continue that transformation of their relationship to the land. Now, from at least the 670s, but almost certainly earlier, we know that the Anglo-Saxon kings adopted the Christian technology of granting land by written diploma. These, in England, we call charters, normally. This is one of the earliest examples surviving from Kent. Now, sadly, we don't have any examples of early charters surviving from Northumbria. But we know that they definitely existed because Bede wrote about the fact that kings granted particular sized areas of land to Benedict bishops, for example, to establish the monasteries at Wearmouth and Jarrow. So this is probably the area of the first grant to Wearmouth here, and this is the area of the first grant to Jarrow up here. These grants of land directly benefited the kings and their families because ecclesiastical and royal elites were intimately linked, often comprising members of the same families. These grants also served to create increasingly dependent or servile relationships with the people who already lived on the land, because the charter, the technology of the charter, enabled you to get control not just of the land, but also of the people who lived on it. This is a very rare object. It's unique from the 7th century in England, but it's a dedication stone. It's the dedication stone of St. Paul's Church at Jarrow. And it says that King Edgefrith dedicated the dedication of the Basilica of St. Paul 8 days before the calends of May, 23rd of April, 685. A month later, he'd gone to Scotland to fight the Picts and was dead. So he'd come from, but he'd recorded this event in stone for the rest of eternity. And that's one of the key points about writing, is that it provides a technology which makes permanent or semi-permanent record of gifts and relationships. So the point is not that writing and landowning and enclosures and other aspects of early Northumbrian Christianity enabled the creation of a social hierarchy, because that already existed. Instead, we should recognise that these technologies facilitate the justification and the consolidation and the stabilisation of certain kinds of hierarchies that had been emerging since the 6th century at least, and perhaps before. So this hierarchy was becoming petrified and ossified, if you like. And during this process, the power relations between people became formalised in new ways, supported by these new technologies. The final one that I want to mention is the transformation of the dead and the way that the community of the dead took part in the lives of the living. So I think that we can argue that the technologies of Christianity and their abilities to change the material properties or the perceived material properties of objects, and in this case the remains of the dead, also enabled elites to shape those networks of hierarchical relationships in the Northumbrian kingdom through the conversion period. And put simply, what I mean is that after the conversion to Christianity, the dead were now able to do things that before the conversion to Christianity they hadn't been able to do. So, the veneration of relics, saintly relics, is well established in Western Christianity before the conversion of Northumbria began. And whilst the way that Christians curated and venerated body parts may have been unfamiliar to the Anglo-Saxons of Northumbria, the fragmentation of the dead and the varying treatments given to different people after their deaths would not be so strange. In southern and eastern and parts of northern Britain, both inhumation and cremation were widely practiced in the 5th and the 7th centuries. So here is an inhumation burial and some of the kinds of grave goods we find. This is a cremation urn into which the remains of the person after cremation will be taken and put into the urn before the urn is buried in the ground. And we used to think that these cremation cemeteries didn't occur in the northeast of England, north of the River Tees, but actually my colleague in Newcastle, Richard Carlton, has discovered one in the last month just to the north of the city. So we are beginning to see them appearing. Now, in common with other parts of southern Britain and also northern Gaul, the archaeology of burials in late 6th century Northumbria is also characterised by a growing distance between ordinary people and the special burials of the social elite. So this is again happening in the late 6th century before the conversion to Christianity. This object is called a hanging bowl. This one is the Capheaton hanging bowl, discovered in the early 19th century near the village of Capheaton outside Newcastle, and almost certainly associated with a barrow burial. Near our sites of Wearmouth and Jarrow, we don't have any of these examples except for this marvellous object, which is called the Bhavan Bottle. It sounds impressive. Actually, it's only about that big. Nevertheless, it is a gold and garnet buckle. And it too came from an isolated burial discovered in the 19th century near the site. So these special burials of the social elite start to become separated from the ordinary cemeteries, and they also start to have more lavish grave goods included with them. And this is connected to the development of these social hierarchies, and I think also to the marking of territories which are beginning to emerge at this period. I just want to share with you this example of a site that we discovered very recently, just a year and a half ago or so, near the village of Whittingham in the middle of Northumberland. Whittingham has a beautiful and not really fully appreciated Middle Anglo-Saxon church, which is worth a visit. But near the village, about 2 kilometres from the village, we find ourselves on the hillside in the valley of the River Alm, looking out across the river valley. And recently, a metal detectorist who lives in the next field, literally his house is in the next field, discovered this peculiar-looking object. And this is a very unusual object for Anglo-Saxon England. It is a sword, a pattern-welded sword, which has been folded in half, like this, and deposited in a burial. And wrapped up with this sword were other objects, a spearhead and a knife, and various brooches and other items. So we thought, this is very interesting. We should go and look at this site because it could tell something valuable about Middle Saxon burials. And so we went to do a small evaluation of the site because we needed to understand the context that these finds have been coming out of. And when we arrived, you can see that my colleagues here are sitting on what looks like it could be a low mound. So it could be a burial mound dating to the late 6th century in which this burial had been deposited, which would be typical for Anglo-Saxon England at that time. And when we made some test trenches into the site where the sword was found and in other areas, we discovered two things. Firstly, it was not a mound. It was a natural outcrop of rock. But secondly, we discovered that in the late Bronze Age, previous people had also thought it looked like a mound. And they had also put a series of burials into this natural knoll. So the Middle Saxons had done the same as the people in the late Bronze Age by mistaking this for an earlier prehistoric burial mound, which it wasn't. But in terms of the burial practices of Middle Saxon Northumbria, this is tied up with this process where elite burials are becoming more distant from the ordinary burials of people. So the diversity of existing treatments of the dead may have enabled the incorporation of Christian practices while simultaneously lending new meanings to existing customs. Some more words are missing. We'll see if they come. Hooray. So, for example, David Rollison, in his book on Northumbria, suggested that Bede's record of King Oswald, King of Northumbria, having his head cut off and his arms cut off and taken to different places for burial after his death, when he was killed by the pagan king of Mercia, King Penda, could have been a Christian interpretation of pagan practices relating to sacral kingship. Well, whatever the true context of the death of King Oswald, his remains were subsequently transformed into major Christian relics. And they were scattered to different parts of Northumbria and Mercia in the south of England, to different churches including Lindisfarne and Bamborough, Bardney and eventually Gloucester on the River Severn. But by the creation of a cult focused on his remains, the role of the king was transformed in his death from being a war leader to being a spiritual protector and intercessor. And other members of the 7th and 8th century social elite experienced similar kinds of transformations, including not only kings, but also abbots of monasteries like Ripon, Lindisfarne, and Wearmouth and Jarrow. So their bones are no longer buried with the community cemetery as they had been in the 5th and the 6th centuries, or even in special mounds as they had been in the late 6th and early 7th centuries. They're now actively protecting the communities in the churches that they have founded. And because relics are curated in churches, they stayed at the heart of thriving communities which had the power to control access to them and to decide how the remains might be venerated. This is the crypt at Hexham, which my colleagues Sophie Huglin and Alex Turner are surveying as we speak. In fact, they're on site now making a ground-penetrating radar survey and laser scan survey of the site and the surroundings. But this is the site of the crypt, and these are twisting underground passages which are designed to perhaps disorientate or create a particular experience in the visitor as they approach the place where the relics of the saint are kept. And the possession of relics within churches like these serve to reinforce their relationships and their links to particular dynasties, particular families, and particular monastic communities. So then the technology of Christian burial enabled the elite to extend their family's influence far beyond the time of their own deaths, remain active in society after they were dead. And that was another innovation in Anglo-Saxon Northumbria. The last thing I talk about before I finish is an interesting potential discovery that we made at Jarrow. Rosemary Cramp, when she originally worked there, identified these two stones, which she called orthostats, in the east end of the church, and thought they looked a bit peculiar, wondered whether they might be related to some kind of archaeological feature, which was no longer visible. So my colleague Alex undertook ground-penetrating radar survey inside the church. And this showed at the top, you can see, this is increasing depth going down from the top. So the top slide shows the Victorian heating system just below the surface of the ground, going down to a depth of about 2 meters below the ground, where we can see these features. We've tentatively interpreted these features as the remains of another crypt underneath the church at Jarrow. Of course, we can't be proved wrong or right unless someone goes and digs the thing up. But for the purposes of this talk, then we'll say that it could be a crypt. And it's very tempting to think that it could even have been a mausoleum built for King Edgefrith, who left here and went off and died at the hands of the Picts at Nechtonsmere a month later, as we said before. Now, that's speculation, of course. We don't even know if it really is a crypt, let alone if it really was for Edgefrith. But it potentially could serve to reinforce this idea of the role of the remains of the dead within the site of the monastery. So, the conclusion then, or what we might be able to interpret from doing this kind of work on these monasteries in Northumbria, something about how the technologies of Christianity in 7th century Northumbria enabled the social elites to further extend their power using the technologies of Christianity. I'm not saying that Christianity created these transformations, because I don't think that it did. I think that a number of processes were already happening, and that Christianity, or the technologies associated with it, building in stone, writing, the ownership of land, the transformation of the dead after burial, provided ways that the social elite recognized they could actively use. That's why they went and founded so many monasteries so quickly and put so many resources into it, actively used to consolidate, to reinforce their social power. So, should you have found this research interesting, you can find some publications. These ones you can already find. This one you will be able to find shortly. At least I hope you will, and so does Elizabeth, because she also has an excellent paper in this volume. The technical reports, some of the technical reports from the work at Wearmouth and Jarrow are available to download from our research centre's website, should that be of any interest. But all of that work is summarised in this book, which is called Wearmouth and Jarrow, and you can get from the internet for the price of about €25 or something. So, and full colour pictures throughout. I have to acknowledge support from English Heritage, who paid for the project, but also paid for the printing of the book, which is why it's quite cheap. Finally, I suppose we can look forward to the future and what work we can continue to do to help deepen these kinds of understandings. Perhaps a research framework and agenda for sites like Wearmouth and Jarrow would be a good idea, bringing together all the archaeologists and historians and others who are interested to develop a series of questions. We have already begun to do some of this work. My colleague Sophie Huglin, who's now surveying at Hexham, is undertaking a comparative project looking at the technological innovations used in the actual construction of the churches in Northumbria, in the region of Basel, and in Tuscany in Italy, comparing the techniques that are used in building the churches. And we've also been doing some new field work using a new laser scanner to create a more detailed model of the structure. And I hope that the next thing we'll be able to do is really to understand the phasing of the building much better using that new laser scan model, because it even eluded the great Rosemary Cramp, because it's quite a complicated building and it's quite difficult to relate the levels to each other. Okay, that's it. So, thank you for your attention.